For millions of Americans, staying up to date on what's happening across the U.S. and world is an important part of their day. This can mean reading the local paper, subscribing to a daily newsletter, or turning on the TV. But for some, this time spent seeking out the news has fallen away. According to the Reuters digital news report, traditional news consumption in the U.S. has decreased significantly over the past year. Compared to 2021, TV viewership is down 20%, and traffic on news websites is down 18% in the first 6 months of 2022. On the flip side, TikTok is the fastest-growing news source for U.S. adults. On top of this, a quarter of all adults now get their news from podcasts. These sources are generally more casual and allow people to pick and choose what topics within news they consume. So, what's feeding this shift? Why are so many Americans abandoning their long-standing traditional news outlets?
Well, they're avoiding the news because there's no good news. I mean, if it wasn't my job, I'd avoid the news too, right? Who wants to read about bloody war in Ukraine? Who wants to read about 19 kids getting assassinated in Texas? Who wants to read about the overthrow of our own democracy? Who wants to read about inflation? Who wants to read about global warming?
That's Joel Kaplan, a professor of magazine, news, and digital journalism at Syracuse University. He says that after the years-long pandemic, many Americans got burnt out on the news. It seemed like for every positive story, there were 100 more negative headlines that drowned out the good. Many just couldn't take it anymore. One of these people is Rolf Dobelli, the author of Stop Reading the News, a manifesto for a happier, calmer, and wiser life. He says he hasn't engaged with the news in 10 years because of the stress it was causing him.
It's been a great experience. I started off just as an experiment a few weeks and shut off all the news sources completely. No newspaper, no online news, no TV, no news on social media. And I felt totally liberated. I had way more time than before. I could think clearly. I was not nervous anymore. It was just a great way of life.
If TV news is on in a public place, Dobelli will walk away. If he sees the paper at a newsstand, he makes sure not to read any headlines. While these actions may seem a bit extreme to some, they're becoming more and more common. The Reuters report actually found that 38% of those surveyed actively avoid consuming the news. So, how does this group get information? Kaplan says it's predominantly from one source.
A vast majority of Americans, almost approaching 100%, get most of their news from social media, right? So whether they're on Facebook and someone shares something with them and they click on it, right? Or Instagram or Twitter. So honestly, I think more people are consuming more news today than ever before, but it depends how you define news.
For the purposes of their report, Reuters defined news consumption as engagement with traditional news outlets like TV, print, and radio. Some of these sources also have a presence on social media, but the vast majority of what generally appears on a person's feed is not thoroughly fact-checked to the same standard as a formal media company.
It used to be, back when I was a reporter, we were kind of the gatekeepers, right? We decide what was news, what wasn't, and only what we determined to be news was what we put in the paper or was on the TV news, right? So the gatekeepers are gone now, which is one reason that you have an issue of fake news or disinformation. But the sharing of that information, even from different perspectives, I think, again, is much more these days than ever been.
While sites like Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms routinely review, edit, and take down false content, all too often, the damage is already done.
The business model of media is to sell advertising against views and clicks and so on. So automatically you bring out sensational stuff. You'll bring out superficial stuff, bright stuff, loud stuff.
Today, many communities have turned into news deserts. In some towns and cities, there's virtually no coverage of local government because there are no community papers or TV stations left. Not only does this allow corruption to go unchecked, but it makes it more difficult for citizens to cast a fully informed vote. Dobelli says he looks at official government websites to read up on current policies and events. He also relies on family and friends for information. He believes this is enough.
How did we do it in the past? How did we do it 300 years ago or 200 years ago? Before we had mass media, we got together and discussed these people in our circle of friends, in the neighborhood. And that's how we formed an opinion. Selecting candidates based on news, I think, is the wrong way to do it, because they pay for advertising. They're trying to influence the media. It's really better to sit down and have real discussions with real friends about these people.
Sometimes talking about politics can bring about productive dialogue. On the other hand, only sharing with people who have similar perspectives can create a distorted worldview. With the increased political polarization in the U.S., many people don't believe that news organizations can stay unbiased and end up turning to social media. However, these sites have algorithms that often direct people towards content that already agrees with or confirms their existing beliefs. Getting news from a variety of outlets on different ends of the political spectrum can help to widen this view, if nothing else. Above all, a free press is an important facet of a democratic society. Kaplan is confident that these traditional media names can reinvent themselves. One idea is adopting the not-for-profit model, which relies primarily on grants and donations for funding. It also focuses more on local communities and public service.
The mogul thing didn't work. But what's worked, the not-for-profit model is starting to work, right? You have ProPublica, who does a lot of investigative stories. Nationally, you have some not-for-profit newsrooms in Texas and elsewhere.
And though this model is imperfect, Kaplan argues that it could help to rebuild some of the trust that's been lost in conventional media. It doesn't have to be one or the other. News on social media isn't all bad. It's just important to question the information. What's the source? Is the video or podcast presenting both sides? Cornell University has a free online guide to becoming a savvier news consumer. Head to viewpointsradio.org to check out this resource, as well as find out more about this topic and our guests. The 2022 Digital News Report can be found on the Reuters Institute website. This segment was written and produced by Grace Galanti. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. Studio production by Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson. Coming up next week.
Only times there's change is when there's protests from the ground. People are protesting, they're voting, making their voice heard. Then the government responds with policies to help make changes.
The difficult conversations and actions that lead to greater equality and opportunity for all. Then,
it's a complicated and difficult road for transit outside of the places that really, really need it.
The state of public transportation in the U.S. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.